I wanted to talk a little bit. I found this really nice article that we're going to read from tonight that we can discuss on 11 misunderstandings about Buddhism, particularly here in the West. I had a Safari window one. Oh, there we go. Cool. It's a really good article. I actually found it on a website called Learn Religions, which is actually a very good resource for, they have a lot of talented writers who seem to really know what they're talking about in a number of different, in all these different religions that they write about. Religions big and small all over the world. And common misunderstandings and mistakes. Common things people believe about Buddhism that aren't true. And I was reading through this article and reflecting on myself, first of all, what it was I was taught about some of these things and what I thought I knew about them before, and try to reflect a little bit on why that was. Now, I need to qualify this because there was some confusion in the past. So I'm conducting this as a Dharma discussion so that we can all kind of study the topic together. I am a student. I am not a teacher. I'm not an ordained priest of any kind. So, please don't accept whatever explanations I have is a avenue of official teaching, but rather an idea as well as a vehicle for the discussion itself. We're all learning here, which is actually kind of the beauty of it. So let's just go ahead and read this article. It was written a couple of years ago, 2019, and the author is Barbara O'Brien. And she writes, "People believe many things about Buddhism that simply are incorrect. They think Buddhists want to get enlightened so that they can be blissed out all the time. Let me save that question for later. If something bad happens to you, it's because something you did. If something bad happens to you, it's because of something you did in a past life. Everybody knows that Buddhists have to be vegetarians. Unfortunately, much of what everybody knows about Buddhism isn't true. Explore these common but mistaken ideas many people in the West believe about Buddhism. 1. Buddhism teaches that nothing exists. Many diatribes are written opposing the Buddhist teaching that nothing exists. If nothing exists, the writers ask, who is it that imagines something does exist? However, Buddhism does not teach that nothing exists. It challenges our understanding on how things exist. It teaches that beings and phenomena have no intrinsic existence. But Buddhism does not teach that there is no existence at all. The nothing exists folklore most commonly comes from a misunderstanding of the teaching of anatta and its Mahayana extension, shunyata. But these are not doctrines in non-existence. Rather, they teach what we understand existence in a limited one. They teach that we understand existence in a limited, one-sided way. So that's a very important distinction. Nothing exists versus something having no intrinsic existence. And I remember, and it might actually be on YouTube, we did a discussion on emptiness. In Buddhism, emptiness does take on another meaning than what we think emptiness is. We discuss emptiness as things having no intrinsic value, no intrinsic property to them. It's a complicated, number of Buddhist teachings, when you get real deep down to it, are pretty complex. And some of it involves a little bit of education, some of it wisdom, and some of it meditating on in order to really kind of get what it is that they're trying to say. And if you're not sure how they're defining intrinsic here, I'm actually trying to see if it'll pull up a dictionary. Yeah. But yeah. But if you take how intrinsic is defined, this basically also kind of feeds into the teaching of dependent origination, that our existence is sort of dependent on the existence of others. It's, again, a pretty complex concept that even I'm still trying to understand fully. But I do recognize that there's a teaching that existence is not independent. But it certainly doesn't teach that nothing exists. I mean, clearly things exist, you know. So So number 2, Buddhism teaches we're all one. Everyone's heard the joke about what the Buddhist monk said to a hot dog vendor, "Make me one with everything." Doesn't Buddhism teach that we're all one with everything? In the Mahanandina Sutra, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that. It also doesn't help that they put a line right through it. All right. In the Mahanidana Sutta, the Buddha taught that it was incorrect to say that the self is finite, but it was also incorrect to say that the self is infinite. In this sutra, the Buddha taught us not to hold on to views about whether the self is this or that. We fall into the idea that we individuals are component parts of one thing, or that our individual self is false and only an infinite self that is everything is true. Understanding the self requires going beyond concepts and ideas. As I go through these, you're kind of going to see a common theme here. Marv, you kind of hit on it a little bit already. Number 3, Buddhists believe in reincarnation. If you define reincarnation as a transmigration of a soul into a new body after the old body dies, then no, the Buddha did not teach a doctrine of reincarnation. For one thing, he taught that there was no soul to transmigrate. However, there is a Buddhist doctrine of rebirth. According to this doctrine, it is the energy and conditioning created by one life that is reborn into another, not a soul. The person who dies here and is reborn elsewhere is neither the same person nor another. Theravada scholar Rapala Rahula wrote. And I'm actually not familiar with that person. I might have to read more on his stuff, his or her stuff. However, you don't have to believe in rebirth to be a Buddhist. Many Buddhists are agnostic to the matter of rebirth. You know, the interesting part about this whole idea of rebirth is that it can be thought of in different ways. For instance, my teacher teaches that one idea of rebirth is very much waking up in the morning after leaving a day behind, leaving one day out and being reborn into a new day. So it really kind of depends on what scope you're putting rebirth in. Number 4, Buddhists are supposed to be vegetarians. Some schools of Buddhism do insist on vegetarianism, and I believe all schools encourage it. But in most schools of Buddhism, vegetarianism is a personal choice, not a commandment. The earliest Buddhist scriptures suggest the historical Buddha himself was not a vegetarian. The first order of monks begged for their food, and the rule was that if a monk was given meat, he was required to eat it unless he knew that the animal was slaughtered specifically to feed monks. And, I remember digging into the whole topic of vegetarianism at one point. I could never be a vegetarian. But yeah, I remember reading on it, and I know that a lot of Tibetan monks to this day still eat meat. And a lot of that has to do with their environment and survival. Tibet is mountainous. The Himalayas are right there, okay? A lot of monks in Tibet live in monasteries in the mountains where there isn't much soil to grow a vast number of crops necessary to feed a monastery. So they can grow some vegetables on their own, but in order to sustain part of their diet and keep themselves alive, they have to purchase meat from the market, So yeah, even monks in some Buddhist traditions are not strictly vegetarian. Oh, goodness. My teacher, Kaylin, when she stayed at Eheiji in Japan, which Eheiji is was the founding Soto Zen monastery in the mountains of Japan. On her first day there, they offered her, I think she said it was squid. I think they offered her squid. And she followed this rule. She ate it. She didn't like it because she doesn't like fish. She doesn't like seafood. But they gave her, the monks gave her meat to eat, basically. Yeah. I don't know how the squid was prepared. But I've had squid both fried and on rice as nigiri sushi, and it's pretty good. I agree. Number 5, karma is fate. The word karma means action, not fate. Karma is a Pali word. That's actually very true. It means literally that it translates to action. In Buddhism, karma is an energy created by willful action through thoughts, words, and deeds. We're all creating karma every minute, and the karma we create affects us every minute. My wife and I got some squid jerky once. Well, I don't think I've ever had squid jerky. That sounds nice. It's common to think of my karma as something you did in your past life that seals your fate in this one. But this is not the Buddhist understanding. Karma is an action, not a result. The future is not set in stone. You can change the course of your life right now by changing your volitional acts and self-destructive patterns. 6, karma punishes people who deserve it. This is the big one. Everyone believes that when it comes to karma, the general rule is what comes around goes around, right? They do something bad. Oh yeah, don't worry, karma's going to bite them in the ass. No, every teacher I've discussed with on karma does not teach this at all. And I believe the author is going to explain this here. So, karma is not a cosmic system of justice and retribution. There is no unseen judge pulling the strings of karma and punishing wrongdoers. Karma is as impersonal as gravity. What goes up must come down. What you do is what happens to you. Karma is not the only force that causes things to happen in the world. If a terrible flood wipes out a community, don't assume karma is somehow brought about a flood or that people in the community deserve to be punished for something. Unfortunate events can happen to anybody, even the most righteous. That said, karma is a strong force that can result in a generally happy life or a generally miserable one. Which kind of makes sense because, again, karma is action. 7. Enlightenment is being blissed out all the time. People imagine that being enlightened is like flipping a happy switch, and that one goes from being ignorant and miserable to being blissful and serene in one big technicolor aha moment. The Sanskrit word, often translated as enlightenment, actually means awakening. Most people awaken gradually, often imperceptibly, over a long period of time, or they awaken through a series of opening experiences, each one revealing just a little bit more, but not the whole picture. Even the most awakened teachers are not floating around on clouds of bliss. They still live in the world, ride on buses, catch cold, and run out of coffee sometimes. Number 8. Buddhism teaches that we're supposed to suffer. This idea comes from a misunderstanding of the First Noble Truth, often translated, life is suffering. People read that and think, well, Buddhism teaches that life is always miserable. I don't agree. The problem is that the Buddha, who didn't speak English, didn't use the English word suffering. In the earliest scriptures, we read that he said life is dukkha. Dukkha is a Pali word that contains many meanings. Nah. I can talk, I swear, folks. It can mean ordinary suffering, but it can also refer to anything that is temporary, incomplete, or conditional by other things. So even joy and bliss are dukkha, because they come and go. Some translators use stressful or unsatisfactory in place of suffering for dukkha. Number 9. Buddhism is not a religion. Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy. Or sometimes, it's a science of the mind. Well, yes, it's a philosophy. It's a science of the mind if you use the word science in a very broad sense. It's also a religion. Even though Buddhism does not require belief in God, most schools of Buddhism are highly mystical, which puts it outside the bounds of simple philosophy. That's a whole big other discussion for another time. Number 10. Buddhists worship the Buddha. The historical Buddha is considered to have been a human being who realized enlightenment through his own efforts. Buddhism also is non-theistic. The Buddha did not specifically teach that there were no gods, just that believing in gods was not useful in realizing enlightenment. Buddha also represents enlightenment itself and also Buddha nature, the essential nature of all beings. The iconic image of the Buddha and other enlightened beings are objects of devotion and reverence, but not as gods. And that's something I often see misunderstood. A lot of people seem to think, well, the Buddha was a god, and so they're he's worshipped. But it's really reverence. I mean, he never said he was a god, never made claims that he was a god, or being in a relationship to like any sort of divine being. He was human. He was born a prince, but he was still a human being. And a lot of us, we do bow to statues of him. We pay respect to that, to his wisdom, to his experience, and his enlightenment, and his ability to teach others. And we also pay reverence to teachers after him for carrying those teachings forward, like Bodhidharma, like there's so many others, like Bodhidharma, like Dainin Katagiri, like Eihei Dogen, like, so many others. Number 11, Buddhists avoid attachments so they can't have relationships. When people hear that Buddhists practice non-attachment, they sometimes assume it means Buddhists can't form relationships with people, but that's not what it means. At the basis of attachment is a self-other dichotomy, a self to attach and another to attach to. We attach to things outside of sense of incompleteness and neediness. But Buddhism teaches the self-other dichotomy is an illusion, and that ultimately nothing is separate. When one intimately realizes this, there is no need for attachment. But that doesn't mean Buddhists cannot be in close and loving relationships. And so that's it for the article. And it's interesting, when I read this article, like a few of these I never really came across, and others I, can look back and realize that I ran into them quite a bit. Some of these, worshiping the Buddha, and the Buddha thinking the Buddha's God. The one with everything, that's a very popular joke. I'm pretty sure everyone's basically heard that one. The philosophy of non-existence. And honestly, I have to wonder if the reason for that, and you touched on it a little bit, Marv, is that some of these concepts that get taught in Buddhism, we don't quite wrap our head around right away. So we're just trying to find something easy, something that we can digest here in the West in order to define it, in thinking that we can better understand it if we say, oh, well, this means this because this is how we can closely relate to it. But we talk about things like intrinsic existence, and we talk about things like, dependent origination. We talk about, the concept of rebirth instead of reincarnation. Karma as a whole, okay, the whole concept of karma is really completely lost on us, even though we have it defined it in such a certain way that most people believe it because that's what seems to make sense to us, And considering that we grow up in a country where some of what we teach in our culture is very Judeo-Christian centric, we're used to the idea that there is something divine or outworldly that can potentially punish us for being bad and reward us for being good. So now this concept of karma comes along. And the way it's being taught, it's like, well, it's almost kind of like this, right? I mean, because you're talking about cause and effect, and this karma is just an energy. So we guess that this energy basically knows what's good and bad and, tries to keep us in check. Kind of like God. Kind of like, and I guess that comes with, the culture of how we're, taught things and how we perceive things, as opposed to, taking the time to really study and sort of understand. This is kind of what comes close, and this is kind of what sticks, So karma is a really fascinating one because it's just so incredibly different from what we believe it is. Or the concept of enlightenment being, you know, I mean, some people believe that enlightenment or nirvana is kind of like heaven for when you die, but for the mind. And, you know, that may be true for some people, but what I do understand is that something like enlightenment, something like a awakening would have to be an intimate experience, and that it's probably going to come to different people in different ways. If it does, for some people, it's all very fascinating. And while there seems to be a lot as far as Buddhism in a guideline sort of sense, some of it is personal experience too. You know, one thing the Buddha did teach, I think it was in the Lotus Sutra, is essentially not necessarily to take his word for everything, but to put his teachings, test them, and if it turns out that what he taught wasn't true, especially for like that time, because, you know, things change, you know, go with what, go with what's there, go with what is correct for that time, go with what is factual for that, you know. And, you know, I think there's a lot of truth to that because, you know, back in the Buddha's day, they didn't have, you know, like, say, all the medical technology or all the science involving gadgets and gizmos and things like computers and iPhones and, you know, all this other stuff. You know, so, you know, he doesn't touch on topics like, you know, how technology can affect society or anything like that, because that wasn't a thing during his day. We're talking 2,500 years ago. So yeah, he taught to be open to the dynamic of life and, you know, of a digital education that comes about. And yeah, this avoiding attachments thing. You know, one thing that one Korean Zen teacher taught me, because I asked him about, you know, if, you know, romantic relationships were considered attachments, and should we be careful about them? Should we be weary of them? Should we avoid them? And he said, no, not necessarily. Not unless you think there's an addiction. He said, but you also have to be careful not to be attached to the idea of not attaching. And I was like, oh, that's good. That is really cool. Okay, so that's the article. I'd be interested in knowing what else you guys think of that. Or any of the topics that were within it. And as we do that, we will go to our games for the night. A lot of that went over your head? Sometimes misunderstandings do that to us. They make the factual go over our head sometimes. That only means finding out more about it, digging a little bit, picking the brains of people who know better than myself.